Hi, everyone. It's Sha-nay Nicole, aka the Empathic Realist. Thank you all for joining me tonight. This is the first in a series of lectures on understanding the global struggle, where we will be focusing on the negative impacts of colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism as it relates to different parts of the world and how it connects back to our own struggle in our own part of the world. And so I thought it only right to start with Palestine, given what's unfortunately going on currently. And so, first, I want to give my love, my prayers, my solidarity, and my support to the people of Palestine, especially those in Gaza and the West Bank and all the Palestinians in Palestine. And then I want to give my love, prayers, support, and solidarity to Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims across the world. I'm so sorry. That's all I can say. And unfortunately, because of this colonial project, we are now, we're seeing remnants again of Islamophobia. And so I just want to say I'm so sorry. And I send you my solidarity, love, and support. And so a little bit about me. I am originally from Houston, Texas. I moved to New York City after receiving my first degree in marketing. I lived there for 13 years, and I would do marketing, advertising, web design by day, and then by night I actually became a professional blues, soul, and jazz singer, and I also did some background singing as well. Did that for about 11 years, and then after the unfortunate passing of my father, I left the corporate world for a while to heal and grieve and help my family. And so that was about 2017, and I had a lot of downtime, and I started seeing the cracks in the system that we know today as capitalism, right? Um, and I saw how it was impacting me directly, and I saw how it was impacting other people that I knew. And I was just like, okay, what is going on? And then obviously at the same time, we had the Black Lives Matter movement, and I was still very much in New York City. And so I began being involved with different activist movements, especially as a marginalized body, as an African American woman whose ancestors come from slavery and the US British colonial project. And so, after about 6 months, I said, I really want to get to the root cause of all of what's happening. Because my theory was that colonialism, was kind of the father and mother of capitalism. And I felt like we were still feeling the violent impacts of that system. And we've never come to terms with the violent and negative impacts of that system. And now we see that it not only affects Black people and people of color, it affects everybody. But we all know that at the root of everything is anti-Blackness. So I decided to go back to school for a second degree in colonial studies while I was still in New York. And that led me down a very cathartic and healing journey of something I termed, of decolonizing my own mind. And so I began to be very involved with different social justice movements. And in particular, I was, involved with a Palestinian liberation movement locally in New York City. And then I started I had my own radio show and a podcast series where I was interviewing different people in the community to understand how their history and how their community was being impacted by colonialism and capitalism. And I was particularly working with a lot of different artists, because I'm a musician and artist myself, and how they were intersecting their art into the colonial struggle. Okay. And so that led me down a journey of saying, well, I really want to create a community or a platform to decolonize other people's minds. And so that is how the Empathic Realist came about. It's a platform that's rooted in decolonial education, as many of you know, if you follow me there, particularly on Instagram, because I really feel that education is a powerful form of resistance. That is why our history, in particular in the United States, we were never taught our real history. Our history has been, as they say, whitewashed. And history in other parts of the world, in particular places that were previously colonized or that were or still are impacted by imperialism, those histories have been in many ways whitewashed. So I wanted to create a platform to really bring out the real history of our collective and global struggles so that we can intersectionally unite and understand that we are all resisting the same system. And so we can then organize intersectionally to eventually rid ourselves of colonial empire in order to build something new that is for everyone, right? So that is who I am, and that is a little bit about me. And so now I want we'll get into the lecture. And obviously this is recorded. I will also have the slides that are accompanying me tonight. You will be able to access them. And I'll also have some additional resources that you can access. And again, like I said, education is a powerful form of resistance and activism. And so the more that you are able to, unlearn and decolonize your mind, your way of thinking, the better armored you are to go out in the world and advocate for not only your local community, but for the global community. So I hope you enjoyed tonight's lecture. So like I said, this evening, we are going to be discussing what led to the current unfortunate genocide and ethnic cleansing taking place across Palestine, along with its connection to colonialism and capitalism. So first, I wanted to start with this beautiful song that I found on Instagram by this wonderful artist, Dana Almir. She is a Qatari singer and filmmaker. And so I'm going to play the video and then I'll bring back up the slide so you can see the English translation.
الحق سلاحي وأقاوم أنا فوق جراحي سأقاوم أنا لن أستسلم لن أرضى وعليك بلادي لأساوم بيتي هنا أرضي هنا بحر السهل النار لنا وكيف بوجه النار أساوم سأقاوم عدوك يا وطن انتحر عليك الكون ما قدر قاوم شعبي جنود الريح تحدى الخوف والخطر ارحلونا ونبقى والأرض لنا ستبقى ها نحن اليوم أقوى في كل الملاحم يرحلونا ونبقى والأرض لنا ستبقى ها نحن اليوم أقوى في كل الملاحم بيتي هنا أرضي هنا بحر السهل النار لنا وكيف بوجه النار أسالم سأقاوم
Beautiful. So before we get started, I wanted to go over a few terms that, some of you I'm sure have seen, especially given what's currently going on in Palestine. Language is important, and it's also a powerful tool when it comes to propaganda, when it comes to, when it comes to indoctrinating a society. So the first term we see here is Semitic. It's relating to or denoting a family of languages that includes Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, and certain ancient languages such as Phoenician and Akkadian, constituting the main subgroup of the Afro-Asiatic family relating to the peoples who speak Semitic languages, especially Hebrew, and Arabic. So then we move to the term Semitism, the fact or quality of being Jewish, Jewishness. Then we go to anti-Semitism, hostility to or prejudice against Jewish people. So as you can see, Semitic versus Semitism and anti-Semitism, there's a large group of people that are missing from the Semitism and anti-Semitism definitions, right? So in some ways, one could say that there is a form of colonizing the word or the definition of Semitic, where you then remove or quote unquote whitewash other groups from another terminology to fit your agenda, right? And that's what we see sort of happening, right? And we will get into this as we go further into the lecture. So I just wanted to highlight that because, like I said earlier, knowledge and education is a powerful form of resistance and a powerful form of activism, because the more we begin to unpack and unlearn what we've been taught, we begin to understand that we've all been indoctrinated to be very divisive and to, act out, these sort of racist or fascist sort of tendencies based on what we are taught from the people in power. And so now we'll go on to the other terminology. So we have apartheid, right? A policy or system of segregation or discrimination on the grounds of race. And I know that now a lot of people have seen how apartheid is also being used when it comes to what is going on in Palestine, because it is a form of apartheid. And even South African leaders are saying that the Palestinian occupation apartheid is in some ways worse than the South African apartheid. So then we see genocide, right? The deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. Ethnic cleansing or racial cleansing is the systematic forced removal of ethnic, racial, or religious groups from a given area with the intent of making a region ethnically homogenous, okay? And that's why this term is used, because, as I said, as we go into the lecture, Palestine was mostly Palestinian people prior to 1948. And so this is why the terms genocide and ethnic cleansing are very much used when it comes to what is going on in Palestine. And then we have settler colonialism, a type of colonialism in which the indigenous peoples of a colonized region are displaced by settlers who permanently form a society there. And that is another reason why, like I said, this is another term that is used when it comes to what Israel did to Palestine. And then occupation or occupied land. In international law, a territory is considered occupied when it is actually placed under the authority of the hostile army. The definition of occupation and the obligations of the occupying power were initially codified at the end of the 19th century. And then lastly, Zionism, which I'm sure a lot of us have been hearing this phrase since the beginning of the current genocide and ethnic cleansing taking place. So Zionism is a movement for originally the reestablishment and now the development and protection of a Jewish nation in what is now Israel. It was established as a political organization in 1897 under Theodore Herzl and was later led by Chaim Weizmann. Now, I also put a note here that many liberation and decolonial scholars, academic scholars included, are now redefining Zionism as another form of white supremacy. So just a little historical background prior to the colonization of Palestine. So Palestine was a part of the Ottoman Empire. And so during the Ottoman Empire, there were 500,000 Palestinians that made up Palestine. They were 75% Muslim, 20% Christian, 5% Jewish. And Palestine had a very thriving culture, in particular in Jerusalem. And, Jerusalem was an artistic and intellectual city with people traveling from across the Ottoman Empire in northern Africa to visit. And the Ottoman Empire comprised Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and Jordan. And so the Ottoman Empire, it began to fall as a result of World War I and allies wanting it dismantled. And we're going to get into why. And so the Ottoman Empire officially dissolved in 1914. So this is very important. Ilan Pepe and some other scholars on, that Israeli and Palestinian scholars have called Zionism a colonial project. So the man here that you see is Theodor Herzl, he's Austrian and Jewish. He was Austrian and Jewish, and he was considered the father of the political ideology that is Zionism. And so Ilan Pepe says, Zionism was a colonialist movement that penetrated the Palestinian homeland by force, with the wish to colonize the country and with possible expansionist ambitions to penetrate the heat of the Arab world. Okay. And Britain and Zionist leaders, they collaborated because they wanted to establish a path to a Jewish state to, in many ways, based on my research and studies, my opinion, it was to gain power within the Middle East, especially following the dissolvement of the Ottoman Empire. And so this is from the Al Jazeera Remix website. It says, the Zionist movement started in the late 19th century amidst growing European anti-Semitism. The movement secured support among Western European governments, particularly after Zionists agreed to create their Jewish state in historic Palestine. The Zionists' early objective was to claim as much of historic Palestine as possible by driving out, ethnically cleansing, the Palestinian population. Zionists actively encouraged the mass migration of European Jews to Palestine during the first half of the 20th century. And in the slides that I sent to you guys, there's a link here where you can read more on the origins of Zionism. So now that we kind of understand the origins of Zionism, that is very important context to understanding how Britain comes into the mix, because there was also a British mandate that was involved, because if you don't know, Britain was the first actually to colonize Palestine. Again, like I said, because there was a desire to have some sort of power and control within the Ottoman Empire, or what we call the Middle East. So before I get into what we know as the 1917 Balfour Declaration, I want to play this clip by Stokely Carmichael, who was later became known as Kwame Ture, because he explains the reason why Britain implemented this Balfour Declaration. And I want to make a side note here. The Pan-African movement and the Pan-African movement in the midst of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, they began connecting the dots to the struggle of Palestine, because by this time, Palestine was already very much colonized. So there were a lot of Black intellectual leaders in the United States and in parts of Africa that were speaking out on what was going on and how Britain was involved in this colonization, and how they didn't really consider Israel a state because instead it was a colonial project. So we're going to play this clip here, and then we'll come back to kind of dive into the Balfour Declaration.
The legal foundation of the State of Israel is what is known as the Balfour Declaration. This declaration was issued in 1917. A man in the government of Britain named Balfour wrote a paper and promised the Jews a national home. The national home he promised them was an area which Britain was colonizing, Palestine. Palestine didn't belong to the British, just like Ireland doesn't belong to the British, even though they have troops there. But here, these British imperialists signed a note and gave it to the Jews, and they accepted it. Where is the morality for this? If you say that Israel belongs to you, then you don't go to a thief to get Israel, you go and take it. Once you go to an immoral being such as British imperialism, and this is the basis for you getting the land, then clearly here those who are truly liberation fighters must question this. The legal foundation.
So I think that's a really powerful and important point that he made there. And he also made a note about Ireland, which, if you have time, definitely look into the history of Ireland. And it was very much colonized by the British. There's a long history there. But it's very important what Kwame Ture is saying. I mean, this is confirming that Israel colonized and Britain colonized Palestine. And so this goes into the 1917 Balfour Declaration. So it was issued November 2nd, 1917. And the Balfour Declaration, or Balfour's Promise in Arabic, was a public pledge by Britain in 1917, declaring its aim to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Because like I said earlier, when we were touching on Zionism, there was this growing anti-Semitism activity going on when it came to the Jewish people in Europe. So this, and like I said, this declaration was created based on the political ideology that we know as Zionism. So though the Balfour Declaration included the caveat that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, the British mandate was set up in a way to equip Jews with the tools to establish self-rule at the expense of the Palestinian Arabs. And so this is what we see, is this brewing desire by the Zionist leaders to basically colonize Palestine. And this is basically saying that though there was this declaration, this British mandate that had sort of these loose, quote unquote, rules, it still provided a path to the colonial project, the genocide, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people. And so these are some reasons. And by the way, this information is from Al Jazeera. And like I said, in my resources document that I will send to you all, or that will be made available, will have the link to this article. So some of the reasons for the Balfour Declaration was control over Palestine, being a strategic imperial interest to keep Egypt and the Suez Canal within Britain's sphere of influence. Like I said, wanting to have some sort of power in the Middle East by the Western colonial powers. Britain had to side with the Zionists to rally support among Jews in the United States and Russia, hoping they could encourage their governments to stay in war until victory. Intense Zionist lobbying and strong connections between the Zionist community in Britain and the British government. Some of the officials in the government of Britain were Zionists themselves, and Jews were being persecuted in Europe, and the British government were sympathetic to their suffering. And I also want to make a note that when they were trying to decide a quote unquote safe place for Jewish people, there were other parts of the world that they were considering. There were places in Africa, there was Argentina. So there were a couple of different places that they were considering. But because of also Britain and the West's desire for that power of control in the Middle East, they, decided on Palestine being that place to colonize. And also, so then later becomes this, story of how Jewish people have an ancient 2,000 story history of claiming of the land. And so this is what ends up going into the 1948 Nakba. So in my opinion, the 1917 Balfour Declaration, in conjunction with Britain having already been colonizing Palestine, this just leaves the floodgates open to Israel eventually becoming a quote unquote state. And I also want to note that up to this point, there were already European Jews that were migrating to Palestine at this point. So now we get to Al-Nakba, which in Arabic means the Great Catastrophe, May 15th, 1948. And so I'm going to read this quote by Rami Khouri, who's a Palestinian American journalist. Israel is the last remnant of the 19th century European white settler racist colonialism. They came, they pushed out the Palestinians, who had 93% of the population of Palestine, and they created an Israeli state. They succeeded, but they only succeeded because they had tremendous support from the white racist colonial British, and now they have it from the Americans. And we obviously see that now with what's going on, and billions of dollars being sent to Israel to continue this genocide and ethnic cleansing. And I'm being very specific in how I'm using my words, because I don't consider it a war when you have a colonial power that has billions of dollars worth of weaponry and has an official military, and the other side does not have Western financial support or an official army. So it's not, in my opinion, it's not a war, because a war is two states, two nations who have armies and military and economic power, who are at war with each other. This is a colonial project, a colonial power that is continuing to participate in the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestinians. So why did this take place? As we said earlier, there was a strong desire by Zionist and European leaders, Britain in particular, to create a Jewish state. And now in this particular instance, this now has to do with what happened following World War II and what was going on in Germany. So from 1919 onwards, Zionist immigration to Palestine, facilitated by the British, as I mentioned earlier, increased dramatically. Chaim Weizmann, who later became Israel's first president, was realizing his dream of making Palestine as Jewish as England is English. Now remember that name, Chaim Weizmann. I mentioned him earlier because he was also connected to the origins of the Zionist project. And so, like I was mentioning earlier, the British mandate had ended by this point. So in early 1947, the British government announced it would be handing over the disaster it had created in Palestine to the United Nations and ending its own colonial project there. So on November 29th, 1947, the UN adopted Resolution 181, recommending the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. So the British occupation authorities had announced that they would be ending their mandate in Palestine on the eve of May 15th, 1948. 8 hours earlier, David Ben-Gurion, who became Israel's first prime minister, announced what the Zionist leaders called a declaration of independence in Tel Aviv. So we see that once the Brits basically said, okay, we're done with this, we don't want to deal with this anymore. So they handed this over to the UN, and that gave way for the Zionist leaders to come in and officially find a way to claim this territory, this country that is Palestine, as their own. And so as a result of the 1948 Nakba, over 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands. So now we go into 75 years plus of occupation, apartheid, and we see that there have been numerous violent colonial actions that took place because Israel was trying to maintain their power and their colonial dominance over Palestine. So one of the next biggest colonial violent action that took place was the 1967 Six-Day War, or as Palestinians called it, the Al-Naqsa, which Naqsa in Arabic is a setback or defeat. So basically what happened was it was a continuation of the Nakba of 1948, but in this regard, Israel basically launched a violent action, not only against Palestine, but against some of the former Ottoman Empire countries, which included Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, because it was trying to gain more colonial territory. So it Israel emerged victorious, gaining control of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula, which the Golan Heights is in Syria and the Sinai Peninsula is in Egypt. So Israel absorbed the whole of historical Palestine, as well as an additional territory from Egypt and Syria. So by the end of this war, Israel had expelled another 300,000 Palestinians from their homes, including 130,000 who were displaced in 1948. So this is why Palestinians call this the Al-Naqsa, because we have what we see is another stage or phase of ethnic cleansing and genocide. And so following this, which we'll get into how Palestine started trying to develop some sort of governance to speak for them. So then we have the first Intifada, which is 1987 through 1993. And so this was a Palestinian resistance against the Israeli rule in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It led to negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, eventually resulting in the Oslo Accords, which we'll get into in the next slide, which established a framework for the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so the Oslo Accords was basically a document that came into play that was trying to pave the way for a two-state solution, which was giving the colonial power, Israel, a right to its state, but then also allowing the Palestinians to create its own state. In my opinion, I think there should be a one-state solution, but that's just how I feel about it. So then we have the second Intifada, 2000 through 2005. And so this is a renewed period of Palestinian resistance marked by increased violence, and it had a significant impact on the peace process, which that's going back to it having a significant impact on the Oslo Accords. So then we see Gaza's ongoing fight for liberation, because by this point, which we're going to also get into, Hamas was created. So Hamas is primarily in Gaza. So there was this ongoing fight for liberation. We see 2008 to 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021, and what we see currently, 2023, which many Palestinian and Israeli scholars are now naming the second Nakba. So and as I just mentioned, most of this quote unquote conflict, violence, was between Israel and Hamas. So, and many independent journalists have disputed Israeli claims as to the instigation of the war outbreaks. The more recent events have caused scores of Palestinian casualties. So I'm going to highlight the origins of Hamas and the origins of the PLO, just so that you can kind of understand, because I know there's kind of been a lot of confusion from some people that have asked me, like, okay, well, does Palestine have its own governance, and sort of like, who is Hamas and who is the PLO, and how do they factor into all of this, right? So Hamas was, their roots trace back to the late 1970s, when activists established charities, clinics, and schools in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank in particular, because those were the most heavily occupied by Israel. Like I said, after Israel occupied both in 1967. And so when I was reading up on this, I said, oh, this kind of sounds like similar origins to the Black Panther movement, when that was created to bring liberation for African Americans in the US. And they also, were the creators of the breakfast program for young kids in schools, when its origin. So it kind of made me, I was able to connect the dots of, other liberation movements that were trying to support their community, right? So Hamas was formally established in December 1987, after the outbreak of a Palestinian uprising known as the First Intifada, which is what I mentioned in the previous slide. And the following year, Hamas declared that liberating Palestine from Israeli occupation was every Muslim's religious duty. Now, here, not once does it state that Hamas wants to eradicate Jewish people. So I want to make sure to emphasize this. Their sole purpose, whether you agree with their actions or not and how they go about it, has always been to liberate Palestine from the colonial power that is Israel, right? And so Hamas's name, I'm going to just get into what the name actually means. It comes from an Arabic acronym that in English stands for Islamic Resistance Movement. And so Hamas is also an Arabic word for zeal. And so today, both the European Union and the United States classify Hamas as a terrorist organization, while others see it as a resistance movement. Over the years, Hamas's reliance on armed resistance has ebbed and flowed, but it has remained committed to its fight for Palestinian self-determination. And since October 8th, they have tried negotiating with Israel for a ceasefire and prisoner swap, as they have held over 4,000 Palestinians captive, but Israel still refuses this offer. However, as of tonight that I'm filming this, I have read reports that they are in official talks for a temporary ceasefire and prisoner swap. So we shall see how that goes. And I also want to note here that, you know, a lot of Palestinians, they don't agree with Hamas. I want to make that very clear. Even my friends that are Palestinian, they don't agree with Hamas, with how they go about this liberation movement. But I also want to know, because I know a lot of people in the media say, well, you know, they won the quote unquote election, you know, so obviously Palestinian people, they back Hamas and its actions. But about 30 to 40% of Palestinians that are alive today were not of age to vote at that time that Hamas was elected into power. So that's very important context to also know. So this is why, again, I say decolonizing the mind, understanding nuance, you know, understanding context is very important, especially when we're talking about oppressed peoples and oppressed parts of the world. You know, we always have to be hypercritical, hyper discerning when it comes to Western media, when it comes to those in power, because they come from systems that are rooted in violence. So we must be discerning, you know, and quote unquote side-eyeing, you know, like what they're saying. And so this is why, again, I say that I'm very passionate about re-education, about decolonizing the mind, because again, we need to understand the real truth of these situations so that we can collectively organize and create a new world. So now I'm going to go into the origins of the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So this was created in 1964, and again, I said that Hamas was created in the 80s. The PLO was created in 1964, and it was as a result of the 1948 Nakba, okay, and the subsequent Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. The PLO's aim was to unite the Palestinian people and to achieve self-determination, whether through the establishment of an independent Palestinian state or through other means. And so, as I mentioned before, the Oslo Accords are very important in this regard to the PLO, because they became officially established as a result of the Oslo Accords. So the Oslo Accords, they were a series of agreements signed between Israel and the PLO in the 90s. Which was a major turning point in the PLO's history, as I just mentioned. The Accords, they recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people and established the Palestinian Authority, a self-governing body with limited control over parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So is that really a democracy for Palestinians? I don't think so. But anyways, the Accords, they were hailed as a breakthrough in the Israeli-Palestinian colonial project, I will say, but they have also been criticized for failing to achieve a lasting peace agreement. And like I said, this peace agreement was to pave the way for a two-state solution. The PLO played a key role in the negotiations that I said led to the Oslo Accords. The organization's willingness to recognize Israel and renounce violence created a new opportunity for peace. However, the PLO also came under, I guess, quote unquote, criticism for making concessions to Israel. And some Palestinians still view the Oslo Accords as a betrayal of their cause, which, again, like I said, because we see that they were establishing a government that had limited control. So that is still not a free democracy in a free and liberating Palestine, right? And they were, you know, the PLO were making some concessions to Israel. I mean, that is the oppressed making concessions to the oppressor. So we can understand why Palestinians would feel betrayed. So despite the ongoing conflict, the PLO remains the dominant political force among Palestinians today. The organization continues to seek a just and lasting peace with Israel, and it plays a vital role in representing the interests of the Palestinian people on the world stage. Now, again, like I mentioned with Hamas, Palestinians have been very critical of the PLO, as you see here as well, but today they're still very critical of the PLO. So, but Palestinians overall, in many ways, their thought process is, well, they're the only ones, Hamas or the PLO, that are, even so, are fighting for our right to exist, our right to the pathway to our land in some ways. So they are the only ones that are sort of giving them a voice, right? So, and it's like, when you back someone into a corner, and you continuously oppress them, abuse them, and then someone says, hey, I'm gonna, advocate for you, I'm gonna get you out of this situation, you have to understand within the limitations that this community is operating within, right? So this is why, the empathic realist, the realist part is the decolonial part, but the empathic part is having compassion and empathy for oppressed communities and having empathy for, sometimes how they choose to resist, because we can also have an argument that, oppressed people, a lot of times their form of resistance is violent, but the oppressor, how they gained control of a land or a people was through violence. So we have to really, again, nuance context. So let's go on to the next one. So here we go into the official, like I wanted to show the map of how the pathway towards this occupation and apartheid. So we see in 1917, which this is pre-British mandate, right before the Balfour Declaration, we see that this is Palestine, right? The green is Palestinian. Then 1948, the Nakba. We see 750,000 Palestinians expelled, as I mentioned. 1967, which was the Six-Day War. We see that Israel takes control over Gaza and the West Bank. They occupy both of those territories, which we see that's Israel, which is blue, is already taken over much of what was Palestine, and now they begin to occupy the only places left that were considered Palestine. And so in 1995, the Oslo Accords, which we see Jerusalem, which we'll get into later, is then fragmented into West Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. Okay, so then there's one part that's Palestinian, one part that's Israeli. So we see, this is a people who are losing their land at the hands of colonialism. So I just wanted to touch on this. So I'm going to read this quote by Avi Shalom, who is a British and Israeli historian. He's Iraqi and Jewish descent. He says, Israel has destroyed the possibility of a two-state solution following their recent and ongoing actions. And I agree. I think that any talk of a two-state solution is, I don't even know how it's possible. So what we see here is just a more breakdown of how Israel colonized Palestine. And here I want to read this, where Al Jazeera says, according to the Human Rights Watch, Israel, which calls itself a Jewish state, is committing crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against Palestinians. And I want to make this clear. Almost every human rights organization has said that Israel is acting out apartheid, is an apartheid state. So this is not like, what I'm saying and what other educators and scholars are saying as far as apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide. This is not like a revolutionary thought. Like, this is well known. So what we see here is there's roughly Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, right? But what we see is In the blue, which is considered quote unquote Israel, there's 5.8 million Israelis, 1.6 Palestinian citizens. And I'll get into how Palestinian citizens became to live in Israel. And then we see in Gaza, no Israelis, but 2.1 million Palestinians. And then, like I said, Jerusalem was fragmented. So West Jerusalem has roughly 350,000 Israelis, 4,500 Palestinians. That's a vast difference. Versus East Jerusalem, which these are settlers. So they're like, this would be, for example, like in the United States when we had Jim Crow South, how there were racist white Americans living in the South, how they would be lording over certain parts of the South with guns and violence, which I mean, in many ways they were. We had sundown towns, etc. But so there's only like, the agreement was that West Jerusalem was for Israelis, East Jerusalem was for Palestinians, but there have been illegal illegal settlements built in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank. So that's why in East Jerusalem, you see that there are Israelis there, almost equal to Palestinians. And then in the West Bank, we see about roughly 460,000 Israelis and 2.7 Palestinians. So I wanted to, this is just another slide on kind of the breakdown of how Palestine was divided into 4 units. And this is from Let's Talk Palestine. So again, this is just more of a breakdown of how the Palestinians have been fragmented into their own land. And so in the 5th category are Palestinians in exile. And it's important to mention Palestinians in exile because Israel denies exiled Palestinians the right to return to their homes, even if they were born there, and their right to self-determination. It simultaneously encourages Jewish immigration, promising immediate citizenship and full rights based on ethnic and religious background. So, I mean, if this is not a colonial project, I don't know what is. And this is just, I mean, every time I read it, and just, it's just crazy to me. So while Palestinians don't currently live under Israel's rule, the denial of their fundamental rights and the discriminatory treatment between the Jewish and Palestinian diasporas, it is another manifestation of apartheid. So like I was saying, I wanted to quickly touch on Jerusalem. So West Jerusalem has been Israeli territory since 1948, with Jews in the majority, and East Jerusalem is Palestinian majority and was occupied by Israel in 1967. And I want you to pay attention to this photo right here, how you see West Jerusalem, which is mostly Israelis, how it looks modernized, it has a train, you know, people are walking and sort of living their life. But East Jerusalem, which is predominantly Palestinians, there's a wall. And it's, you know, minimal rights. There's no advancement in technology. So think about that. And so I just want to read this quote here from Al Jazeera. In 1980, Israel passed the Jerusalem Law, claiming that Jerusalem, complete and united, is the capital of Israel. In violation of international law. Again, we keep seeing they keep violating so many international laws, which states that the city should be administered by the UN for its importance to the 3 Abrahamic religions. Although Israel claims Jerusalem as its undivided capital, the realities for those who live there cannot be more different. More than 140,000 Palestinian residents of Jerusalem have been physically separated from the city by a 700-kilometer concrete wall that you see here, which Israel started building in 2002. Does build the wall sound familiar? That's all I'll say. So speaking of the rights, I wanted to highlight this. This is again from Let's Talk Palestine. And it just talks about ironically, it's a pyramid, but it talks about the rights of Palestinians. So Palestinians in exile, like I said, they can't reside in any unit, even if they were born there. Then in Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza are prohibited from relocating to any other geographical unit trapped in the besieged strip. So that means they can't go to West Bank, they can't go to East Jerusalem, they can't get citizenship to live in Israel. Palestinians in the West Bank cannot relocate to East Jerusalem or the Heartland to upgrade their status to permanent residency or citizenship, which Heartland is just the other parts of Israel. And then for East Jerusalemites, upgrading to citizenship is often inaccessible, if not impossible. And obviously, Jewish Israelis have all the rights in the world. But Palestinians, they can relocate if it means downgrading. Okay, so Palestinians with Israeli citizenship or East Jerusalem residency, they can relocate to the West Bank, but this threatens their rights and status. Palestinians in the West Bank, they can relocate to Gaza if they sign a pledge surrendering their rights and vowing never to return to go back up the pyramid. Meanwhile, Jewish Israelis can move freely between all units except the Gaza Strip, but they still maintain full rights. And this is very important. I mean, this is, similar to, the civil rights, Jim Crow laws of the United States when it came to African Americans and many, but this to me, I mean, the Israeli colonial project is a very, very extreme form of apartheid and colonialism, in my opinion. So I just wanted to briefly touch on Palestinians as political prisoners. Palestinians are often arrested literally for no reason other than resisting colonialism, which is, in my opinion, their right to do so. So many Palestinians view detainees in Israeli prisons as political prisoners who are being held because of the Israeli occupation or their resistance to it. There are at least 4,700, and the number is higher now, Palestinians in Israeli prisons, including 150 minors, 34 women, and 835 people held without trial or charge, according to the Ramallah-based Adamir Prisoner Rights Group. And so, again, going back to rights, Israeli rights versus Palestinian rights. Palestinians are tried in military courts. I mean, could you imagine being tried in a military court and not being in the military? I mean, you would be horrified. Versus Israelis, Jewish Israelis, being tried in a regular court of law like the rest of us are, So here, The Guardian says, the military judicial system is part of a separate and unequal reality. In contrast to Palestinians, Israeli settlers arrested in the West Bank are tried in civilian courts inside Israel. Two populations, two different legal systems. Israel's largest human rights group is therefore right to call this a form of apartheid. Remember, Nelson Mandela was arrested and labeled a terrorist before he became this beacon of speaking out about human rights later in life, okay? Any occupying power is obliged to act in the interest of the occupied population. Israel, by contrast, is violating Palestinian civil and political rights. In addition, as UN Special Rapporteur Michael Link has laid out, after half a century, Israel's role as occupier has crossed a red line into illegality. Illegal. Okay, I'm really passionate about this just because I'm always a believer in bringing up, uplifting the oppressed communities. And I mean, every time I read this, and it just blows my mind that we still have these types of systems in place and that they're allowed, even if they're against international law. So this is a singer from one of my favorite groups, 47 Soul. They are a Palestinian group, and I want to play this clip here of him speaking on colonialism.
We come from the Holy Land. The Holy Land been for centuries and ages a multicultural place, metropolitan. And unfortunately, colonialism came and divided us in order to teach us how to live together after we've been living together for thousands of years. And I think this is the mission of this band as well, that we come to emphasize the culture that, unfortunately, colonialists try to enforce on us. And the people who are controlled, like the people of the colonialists, are also monopolized, and they don't know the right info that the colonializers, their leaders, are implementing and enforcing, you know. So maybe the music could be, well, it's not the tool, but it could be. Just
so like you said, you know, for him and his band, you know, they're utilizing speaking out based on in their music. And, you know, I'm also a musician and a singer, and I think, you know, music artistry is a powerful form of resistance. But I just wanted to highlight that clip as he is a Palestinian and, you know, just connecting the dots to colonialism. So now, speaking of connecting the dots, I'm going to end today's lecture on, now we're connecting the dots to how this colonial project is similar to the colonial project that in particular took place in the United States. Why I'm doing this is because, again, like I said at the beginning of the lecture tonight, I want us to, you know, find a way to connect those dots of our collective global struggles, so we see that we're more alike than different, and that there is a common goal to eradicate the violent systems in place in order to create systems of peace, of love, of embracing intersectionality in all forms. So what we see here, right? I mean, a similar story. Trail of Tears and El Nakba, the colonization of Turtle Island, which is the United States, and Palestine. Both brutal colonial projects rooted in white supremacy. Both experienced genocide and ethnic cleansing. Both experienced loss of homeland and ancestral cultural traditions. Both experience extinction of bloodlines. Both have collective community trauma, and both experience ongoing racial injustice and displacement. And this is particular to the Native American community in the United States also, which is originally called Turtle Island. And this is why you see, I mean, there was a beautiful piece, a beautiful graphic I saw on Instagram, which said "From Turtle Island to Gaza," you know, and it was a beautiful image of a Native American indigenous man with the ancestral attire, with a beautiful Palestinian man in his ancestral attire. And so, like, again, our struggles are similar. Our job now is to connect the dots so that we can organize and mobilize. And so I also wanted to make the connection between African Americans and Palestinians, and how they've both experienced horrendous forms of racism at the hands of the occupying communities. So we see the Jim Crow South and the KKK. You see at this church here, we do not welcome the colored. And as we all know, and many of us know, in the United States, African Americans experience racial discrimination, severe forms, especially in the U.S. South. There was institutionalized segregation in most, if not all, public spaces. The creation of the white supremacist group, the Ku Klux Klan, which focused on brutal violence, intimidation, and terrorism towards African Americans and people of color. And yes, it was terrorism. And also systemic racism that led to severe economic disparities for African Americans, and no opportunities for upper mobility. And so what we see here on the other side, illegal Jewish settler colonies. And I'm sorry, I am not one for violence, and I was trying to find an image that did not have a gun in it, but I could not find one, and that speaks volumes to me. So anyways, illegal Jewish settler colonies. So Jewish settlers have been involved in the establishment of these illegal settlements across Palestine that contribute to the ongoing segregation of Palestinian and Israeli populations. There are separate roads, infrastructure, legal systems for Israeli settlers and Palestinians in the West Bank, for example. Jewish settlers have been known to partake in violence, harassment, and intimidation against Palestinian communities. The expansion of the colonization of Palestine involved Israel bringing in Jewish settlers to displace Palestinians. Palestinians in some regions are forced to sell Israeli products, even if they can't understand the Hebrew language of the products because they speak Arabic, which again creates economic disparities for Palestinian products and Palestinian farmers. So again, we see two similar forms of oppression, two colonial powers that are oppressing marginalized communities and then allowing regular white citizens to enable that colonial system that is violent at its root. So yes, I just wanted to highlight that comparison there. And so lastly, I want to especially, and I'm glad we're ending here, talking about these two powerful phrases that have both been deemed violent towards the white community, which isn't true, we know. So from the river to the sea. The majority of Palestinians who use this phrase do so because they believe that in 10 short words, it sums up their personal ties, their national rights, and their vision for the land they call Palestine. And while attempts to police the slogan's use may come from a place of genuine concern, which I don't necessarily agree with that, but there is a risk that tarring the slogan as anti-Semitic and therefore beyond the pale taps into a longer history of attempts to silence Palestinian voices. The reason why I say I don't necessarily agree with this definition here of saying that there's this risk of there may be there's this genuine place of concern for the phrase. I mean, I don't agree with that just for the simple fact that nowhere in that phrase is there any form of instigation of violence towards another community. To me, it's a people who are calling their ancestors, who are honoring their ancestors, and who are saying, we have been colonized and oppressed, and we just want to be free from the river to the sea. We want our land back, right? And so I don't necessarily agree that any pushback would be a genuine concern. For me, a pushback is a opportunity for reflection. If for those of you that don't know, I've been a Buddhist for 15 years, and the root of that practice and what really stuck out for me, which is why I still practice it, is the art of self-reflection. And so for me, people have been triggered with this from the river to the sea because it's a trigger of needing to dig deeper to understand why a phrase such as this would trigger you in the first place. Why is it that you are not wanting to be supportive of Palestinians having their right to exist and a right to their land? So the phrase is not just simply a reference of geography, it's political. From the river to the sea also seeks to reaffirm Palestinians' national rights over their homeland and a desire for a unified Palestine to form the basis of an independent state. So I bring in Black Lives Matter, that phrase, because again, there was a lot of criticism about it. People were like, well, what about me? All lives matter, Blue Lives Matter. And, and I'm going to read this here, but it says, when it comes to race, white people have a lot to be guilty about. Acknowledging the reasons for this is the essential component in white people coming to be at peace with this feeling. However, Black Lives Matter is not trying to make white people feel guilty. If we do start to feel guilty when movements like BLM gain traction and/or media interest, it shows that the movement has caused people to think more about their own thoughts and actions, and this can actually be a positive thing. Reflection is vital here. So this goes back to From the River to the Sea, where this writer is trying to say, well, maybe there is a call of genuine concern for people wanting to police or criticize From the River to the Sea. No, because this right here, Alex Leader, what he says here, because these are white people in Israel who are criticizing From the River to the Sea, and this pertains to them. That this is a moment of reflection for them. This is a time for them to reflect on the origins of Palestine, how their ancestors, ethnically cleansed and genocided the people that were living there so they could be there, right? There's a lot to reflect on. And so just going back to Black Lives Matter, we can all agree that all lives matter. Not only this, but every life is of equal value. And BLM does not dispute this. The whole purpose of the Black Lives Matter movement is to shine a light on oppression and fight for equality, to demand change in the pursuit of equity. The movement itself states it works vigorously for freedom and justice for Black people, and by extension, all people. And so, one thing I loved about the Black Lives Matter movement and just the discourse that was going on is just like, when Black people are free, everybody is free. Because like I said towards the beginning of this lecture tonight, all of these systems are rooted in anti-Blackness. And so the more, when we understand that, we come closer to healing a lot of collective trauma and wounds that we all have because of colonialism and white supremacy and capitalism. So I just wanted to end here just to say, like, these are two powerful phrases, because these are two communities that have been severely and violently marginalized for so long. And these phrases are a way for them to speak their truth and have their voices heard, so that this is their way of fighting for their autonomy and their right to exist. So as we end here, ways to support Palestine, right? Education, attending teach-ins and educational webinars like this, reading books by authors that are advocating for the liberation of Palestine, watching documentaries and independent news sources to learn the history of Palestine and the facts of the ongoing occupation. Protests, safely attend protests in your area, research BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction movements. There are other forms of protesting, obviously. Community, join activist groups in your area, engage in conversations with those you trust to discuss how you are feeling, create group chats with your friends, support Palestinian voices via social media and their work on other digital platforms. Find ways to take care of those in your community, especially right now, Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims in your community. And so I just want to thank you guys again for watching and for listening. I hope you got something out of today's lecture. And again, these slides will be made available online, along with some additional resources. And I'm just going to end with a song by one of my favorite hip hop artists, Low Key. If you don't know who he is, please look him up and download his music, because he is reviving what hip hop was created for. Being a voice for the voiceless, being a voice for the marginalized, and speaking truth to power. And he is an Iraqi and British activist and hip hop artist. So I want you to read what I quoted here, which is something I wrote based on just weeks of reflection of what's currently going on in Palestine, and connect it to this song as I'm playing it. And again, thank you. And I send my love, solidarity, support, and prayers to the people of Palestine. Peace and love.
They're calling me a terrorist, like they don't know who the terror is. When they put it on me, I tell them this: I'm all about peace and love. They're calling me a terrorist, like they don't know who the terror is. Insulting my intelligence. Oh, how these people judge.
It seems like the ragheads and packies are worrying your dad, but your dad's favourite food is curry and kebab. It's funny but it's sad how they make your mummy hurry with her bags. Rather read the Sun and study all the facts. Tell me, what's the bigger threat to human society? BAE systems or homemade IEDs, remote control drones killing off human lives, or man with homemade bomb committing I know you were terrified when you saw the towers fall. It's all terror, but some forms are more powerful. It seems nuts. How could there be such agony when more people die from peanut allergies? It's like the definition didn't ever exist. I guess it's all just dependent who your nemesis is. Irrelevant how eloquent the rhetoric peddler is. They're telling fibs now. Tell us who the terrorist
They're
is.
calling me a terrorist, like they don't know who the terror is. When they put it on me, I tell them this: I'm all about peace and love. They're calling me a terrorist, like they don't know who the terror is. Insulting my intelligence. Oh, how these people judge.
Lumumba was democracy, Mossadegh was democracy, Allende was democracy, hypocrisy, it bothers me. Call you terrorists if you don't want to be a colony. Refuse to bow down to a policy of robbery. Is terrorism my lyrics? When more Vietnam vets killed themselves after the war and died in it. This is very basic. One nation in the world has over 1,000 military bases. They say it's religion when clearly it isn't. It's not just Muslims that oppose your imperialism. Was Hugo Chavez a Muslim? Nah, I didn't think so. Was Castro a Muslim? Nah, I didn't think so. It's like the definition didn't ever exist. I guess it's all just dependent who your nemesis is. Irrelevant how eloquent the rhetoric peddler is. They're telling fibs now. Tell us who the terrorist
They're
is.
calling me a terrorist, like they don't know who the terror is. When they put it on me, I tell them this: I'm all about peace and love. They're calling me a terrorist, like they don't know who the terror is. Insulting my intelligence. Oh, how these people judge. They're calling me a terrorist, like they don't know who the terror is. When they put it on me, I tell them this: I'm all about peace and love. They're calling me a terrorist, like they don't know who the terror is. Insulting my intelligence. Oh, how these people judge. You think that I don't know, but I know. You think that we don't know, but we do. You think that I don't know, but I know, I know, I know. You think that we don't know, but we do.